In the summer of AD 65, when the Roman Empire trembled under the weight of conspiracies, punishments, and imperial paranoia, a single event unfolded behind the high stone walls of Nero's palace that would later shock even hardened Roman historians. It was in this season of fear, when the emperor believed every whisper hid betrayal, that he made a decision so unnatural and so horrifying that it would become one of the darkest stories in imperial history. In the private chambers of the Palatine Hill, Nero prepared to replace the dead Empress Poppaea not with a noblewoman, nor with another political bride, but with a young boy whose life, identity, and body he would reshape by force. The boy's name was Sporus, and his fate would expose the twisted extremes of Nero's grief, obsession, and need for control. To understand how such a terrifying transformation could occur, one must step back to the tragic death of Poppaea Sabina, Nero's adored and controversial wife. Ancient sources describe her as ambitious, manipulative, and stunningly beautiful, a woman who climbed from noble birth to ultimate power through charm and ruthless calculation. Nero was infatuated with her. Her presence soothed him, and her praise fed the emperor's desperate hunger for validation. She supported his artistic ambitions, encouraged his public performances on stage, and shaped his image before the Roman elite. She was not simply his wife, she was the heart of his unstable world. But in AD 65, during her pregnancy, Poppaea died. Accounts vary on how it happened. Some sources suggest an illness. Others, more sensational, claim Nero struck her in a fit of rage. Regardless of the cause, one fact remained. The emperor was devastated. His grief spiraled into something darker than sorrow, something that mixed longing, denial, and a refusal to accept that she was gone forever. Roman emperors had power over life and death, but even Nero could not command mortality itself. Yet, in his madness, he attempted something equally disturbing. He would recreate Poppaea through another living being. It was during this period of mourning that Sporus was taken. Ancient writers describe him as a beautiful young boy, delicate in appearance, gentle in manner, and strikingly reminiscent of Poppaea's feminine grace. Whether this resemblance was natural or exaggerated by storytellers, Nero saw something in him that triggered both anguish and desire. Sporus was selected to become more than a palace servant, more than a companion. He was chosen to become the replacement for a dead empress, a living shadow molded by imperial will. The transformation began with an act that still shocks the modern world. Nero ordered that the boy be forcibly castrated. The practice of creating eunuchs was not unknown in ancient empires, particularly in the East, but Rome viewed it with disdain. Roman masculinity was tied to honor, lineage, and bodily integrity. To mutilate a child in this way violated every cultural boundary, yet Nero's command could not be questioned. Once the order was given, the boy's fate was sealed. He was taken into private quarters, prepared by palace physicians, and robbed of the future nature intended for him. The procedure itself was life-threatening. Many boys did not survive. The fact that Sporus lived marked the beginning of a new identity he never chose. After this irreversible act, Nero began shaping the boy into his vision of Poppaea. He assigned attendants to dress him in garments worn by imperial women. He ordered him to be trained in the mannerisms of the former empress, from her gestures to her silent poise in ceremonial settings. He called him by her name in private moments, praised him as her reborn image, and blinded himself to the disturbing reality of what he had done. This was not love nor even grief. This was domination disguised as affection, an emperor reconstructing the past through violence. Outside the palace, Rome sensed something deeply wrong. Senate members whispered amongst themselves, careful never to speak too loudly. Slaves who served in the imperial household carried rumors outward, whispering of the young figure being reshaped to resemble the dead empress. The empire was no stranger to scandal, but even Rome, with all its decadence, was unsettled by what it heard. Yet no one dared challenge Nero, for this was the same emperor who executed senators for glancing at him the wrong way, the same ruler who burned his rivals alive for entertainment. If he could kill the mother of his unborn child in rage, what would he do to anyone who questioned his living tribute to her? Sporus himself was trapped in a gilded cage. He was not a willing participant. He was not a fiancé or a lover. He was a boy stripped of agency, manipulated into performing the role thrust upon him. As he was dressed, adorned, and renamed, he entered the empire's darkest stage play, one in which Nero was both director and audience, expecting perfection from the young figure who was supposed to bring Poppaea back to life. He learned quickly that resistance meant punishment, and obedience meant survival. The looming question is why Nero chose Sporus. Was it truly grief? Was it madness? Or was it the emperor's belief that he could reshape the world according to his desires, bending nature itself to his will? Ancient historians such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe Nero as a man who blurred lines between performance and reality. He sang on stage before cheering crowds, raced chariots like a professional competitor, and imagined himself a god of art and beauty. For such a mind, the idea of recreating his Empress was not horrifying but theatrical. He was staging a resurrection, one only he believed in. By the end of AD 65, Sporus had been fully absorbed into Nero's household as the symbolic reincarnation of Poppaea. He was given jewels, servants, and ceremonial duties. People were ordered to address him with feminine titles. In private, Nero treated him as a spouse, but the world beyond the palace walls remained tense. The empire was sliding into deeper chaos. Conspiracies were forming, and Nero's grip was weakening. Still, within his private chambers, the emperor clung to the illusion he had created, blind to the consequences of this terrible transformation. This was the beginning of a story that would grow even darker, for Sporus was not merely reshaped. He would eventually be displayed before the entire Roman world in a public ceremony so shocking that even hardened aristocrats trembled at the sight. His story, born from grief and imperial cruelty, would echo long after Nero's death, revealing the horrifying lengths to which power can distort humanity. After the winter of AD 65, the imperial palace transformed into a stage where Nero's fantasies took precedence over law, custom, and morality. By this time, Sporus, now forced to live as the reflection of Poppaea, was no longer just a private obsession hidden in the emperor's chambers. Nero's madness demanded spectacle. His grief demanded witnesses. His ego demanded that Rome itself acknowledge the young boy not as a victim, but as an empress reborn. And so Sporus's transformation became a public ritual, one that would shock the capital and force senators, generals, and nobles to participate in a charade that contradicted every Roman ideal of masculinity, dignity, and honor. In early AD 66, when news spread across Rome that Nero intended to marry Sporus, many believed the rumors were exaggerated, the work of slaves and palace informers eager to sell gossip. But disbelief faded when invitations were issued for what Nero called a celebration of love and rebirth. High-ranking officials, terrified of refusing the emperor, arrived in ceremonial robes, musicians assembled, guards lined the marble halls, and at the center of the grand atrium, Sporus appeared dressed in the garments of an imperial bride, veiled like Poppaea on her wedding day. Nero, wearing the robes of a groom, took his hand in a ceremony witnessed by hundreds. This was no symbolic gesture. Nero conducted the marriage as if it were legally binding. He exchanged vows, placed Sporus under the protection of household guards, and ordered the palace scribes to record the event as they would any imperial union. The boy was paraded through the streets, escorted by a procession that normally carried an empress. The public watched in stunned silence as Sporus, veiled and adorned, moved through the heart of Rome like a ghost of Poppaea brought back against nature's will. Whispers filled the crowd, not out of curiosity, but terror. When an emperor's madness became law, silence was survival. Sporus, barely more than a child, was now trapped in a role from which there was no escape. Every gesture he made was observed, interpreted, and judged. Every mistake risked Nero's anger. To the imperial court, he was not Sporus. He was Poppaea reborn, a symbol of Nero's refusal to accept loss and a living reminder of the emperor's dominance over life, death, and identity. At public events, Sporus was required to sit beside Nero as a spouse. He received obedience from servants, respect from senators, and awe from common citizens, all forced performances of loyalty to the emperor's delusion. Behind the facade, palace life grew increasingly dangerous for Sporus. Nero's paranoia intensified. Rebellions simmered in the empire's provinces. Revolts in Judea, unrest in Gaul, and murmurs of dissatisfaction within the Praetorian Guard added pressure to a ruler who was already collapsing under guilt and self-loathing. Nero believed prophecies that foretold betrayal. He executed senators, generals, and even former friends. Anyone whose loyalty was uncertain met a violent end. In such an environment, Sporus had no protector. His survival depended entirely on Nero's emotional instability. Yet the emperor's affection toward him, if it could be called affection, was real in its own distorted way. Nero spoke to him with Poppaea's name, rehearsed memories of his late wife in Sporus's presence, and demanded that the boy behave exactly as she once did. In moments of performance and ritual, Nero smiled at him with a fervor that frightened even his closest advisers. But affection also meant ownership. He expected obedience, gratitude, and reverence. Sporus was not allowed private identity. He belonged to Nero, body and soul. The ceremonies surrounding their union continued through AD 66, becoming grander and more humiliating. At one banquet, Nero ordered guests to bow to Sporus as Empress. At another, he paraded the boy before foreign ambassadors, forcing them to acknowledge him with the same diplomatic courtesy they would show a royal bride. The empire's elites, terrified of contradicting Nero, complied. The humiliation was not only Sporus's, it was Rome's. For centuries, Roman masculinity had been linked to strength, self-control, and dominance. Nero's spectacle undermined these ideals, revealing an emperor who treated gender, identity, and tradition as mere toys for his personal theater. In private moments, Sporus suffered in silence. He was separated from peers, from family, from a normal life. He lived surrounded by luxury, but stripped of personal freedom. Every day he wore clothing chosen by attendants. Every hour he was watched. Even his expressions were monitored so he appeared gentle, graceful, and composed, just as Poppaea had been. Historian Cassius Dio describes Sporus as a figure of tragic beauty, a living symbol of what happens when imperial power crushes humanity. While Rome watched this grotesque transformation, the empire itself began to fall apart. The Senate grew restless. Provincial governors doubted Nero's fitness to rule. Military commanders saw opportunity in imperial weakness. The Great Fire of Rome, Nero's increasing persecution of elites, and the brutal executions of those suspected in the Pisonian conspiracy turned powerful families against him. The empire murmured with rebellion. Through all of this, Sporus stood at Nero's side, displayed at ceremonies that masked the empire's collapse. He accompanied Nero to games, banquets, and religious festivals. He comforted him during public distress. He sat with him at council meetings where Nero wept, screamed, or sang instead of ruling. Sporus became both companion and decoration, a living portrait Nero used to distract himself from the political catastrophe unfolding around him. By AD 68, Nero's rule had spiraled beyond repair. Governors in Gaul and Hispania revolted. The Praetorian Guard betrayed him. Senators declared him an enemy of the state. As Nero's world collapsed, he clung to Sporus more desperately than ever. The boy, once a symbol of rebirth, became a symbol of Nero's unraveling. Nero could not save his empire. All he could do was hold onto the creation he had forced into existence. When Nero fled Rome in June AD 68, Sporus was among the small group who accompanied him. They traveled to a villa outside the city, hiding from soldiers sent to arrest the fallen emperor. Nero, fearing torture and execution, debated the manner of his own death. In those final hours, it was said he looked at Sporus and murmured, "If only you had been born a woman." The tragic irony hung heavily in the air. Nero had spent years forcing Sporus to live as one. Shortly afterward, Nero took his own life. His final words expressed the terror of leaving the world he had dominated and performed for. Sporus, freed from the emperor's grasp, did not escape the consequences of having been Nero's creation. His story was far from over, and what awaited him after Nero's death would reveal even more about the cruelty of imperial politics, desire, and vengeance. When Nero's body lay lifeless in the villa outside Rome, the empire did not pause to grieve. Instead, it convulsed. The year of the 4 emperors began, plunging Rome into chaos, assassinations, shifting loyalties, and violent competition for the throne. Yet, amid the political storm, one figure drifted from ruler to ruler like a tragic relic of Nero's madness. Sporus, the boy the emperor had castrated and forced to replace his dead empress. With Nero gone, many expected Sporus to disappear into anonymity, perhaps return to a private life, or even attempt escape. But the empire was not finished using him. His fate would be shaped not by freedom, but by powerful men who saw in him a living symbol they could exploit for spectacle, legitimacy, or revenge. After Nero's suicide, the first man to take Sporus into his household was Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious praetorian prefect who had betrayed Nero and supported Galba's rise to power. Nymphidius was a man intoxicated by influence, clever enough to overthrow an emperor but foolish enough to believe he could become one himself. In his lust for authority, he convinced himself that he was the rightful successor to Nero's throne. To strengthen this illusion, he brought Sporus into his care and treated him as though he were the widowed empress of the late emperor. In his delusions, possessing Sporus made him appear closer to Nero's power. Nymphidius paraded the boy through his private halls, demanding servants bow and address him with titles Nero had forced upon him. But unlike Nero, Nymphidius lacked charisma and royal lineage. The Praetorian Guard refused to support his claim, turned against him, and killed him before he could seize the throne. His ambitions ended in a single afternoon. Sporus, however, survived yet again, passed along like a fragile and unwilling treasure between powerful men who viewed him not as human, but as a symbol that legitimized their connection to the dead emperor. After Nymphidius's death, the new Emperor Galba took power. His rule was harsh, inflexible, and cold. Galba had no interest in Nero's decadence nor his personal creations. To him, Sporus was an embarrassment, an echo of Nero's corruption. Galba dismissed him, stripping him of status and returning him to obscurity. Yet even this relative freedom did not last, for when Galba was killed and Otho seized the throne, Sporus's tragic cycle tightened once more. Otho was no stranger to Nero's world. He had once been a friend, companion, and even rival of the late emperor. He understood the symbolic power that Sporus carried. Otho saw in him not just a memory of Nero's madness, but a link to a past that still captivated segments of the Roman public. So Otho welcomed Sporus into his household, not as an object of humiliation, but as a delicate figure connected to imperial drama. Compared to Nero and Nymphidius, Otho treated him with a measure of gentleness. Roman historians describe that he protected Sporus and valued his presence, not out of cruelty, but out of a strange nostalgia for the world Nero had created. But Otho's time as emperor was brief. His defeat by Vitellius plunged Rome into deeper turmoil. And when Vitellius rose to power, Sporus's fate took a horrific turn. Vitellius was a man known for gluttony, cruelty, and a taste for sadistic entertainment. When he learned of Sporus and the story of Nero's forced marriage, he was not disgusted. He was intrigued. He saw an opportunity not for affection or symbolism, but for theatrical humiliation. Vitellius devised a spectacle, a reenactment of the Greek myth of Proserpina, in which a maiden is dragged into the underworld. He planned to place Sporus in the role of the maiden, to parade him before cheering crowds as he was violated by an executioner, turning the boy's tragedy into a public performance of cruelty. This was not about Nero. This was about the Roman hunger for entertainment and Vitellius's desire to surpass all emperors before him in excess. When Sporus learned of Vitellius's plan, something in him broke. For years he had survived transformations, humiliations, and the crushing weight of imperial power. He had been shaped into an empress, paraded as a bride, passed between rulers, and used as a political symbol. But the idea of being forced into a violent, degrading stage performance before thousands was more than he could endure. Rather than suffer this final humiliation, Sporus took control of the only choice left to him. He ended his own life before Vitellius's spectacle could take place. In that moment, he reclaimed the smallest fragment of agency stolen from him years before by Nero's command. His death was a quiet act of resistance, the last action of a life shaped entirely by others. He died young, remembered not for deeds he chose, but for torment inflicted upon him. Yet his story did not fade. Ancient historians preserved it as a haunting warning about absolute power, imperial obsession, and the destruction that follows when a ruler treats human beings as objects to satisfy grief, fantasy, or cruelty. Sporus's life became a mirror reflecting the darkness of Nero's reign and the brutality of a political system that allowed children to become tools of emperors. His suffering exposed the twisted extremes of power, where identity could be stripped away, where gender could be reshaped at a tyrant's whim, where a child could be molded into a dead woman for the sake of one man's illusion. Even more tragically, his death revealed the world Rome had become in the decade after Nero, a place where cruelty was entertainment, where emperors performed sadism on public stages, and where the vulnerable had no protection except escape through death. Yet, there is a deeper reason Sporus's story survived. His fate forces us to confront the question of what power becomes when unchecked. Through his suffering, Rome witnessed the consequences of allowing a single ruler to dominate bodies, identities, and destinies. His life, and the way it was twisted by emperors, became a lesson for generations of historians. Sporus was not a rival, nor a rebel, nor a threat to the empire. He was simply a child who resembled a dead empress. And for that, he became a symbol, a possession, a performance, and ultimately a casualty of the empire's darkest impulses. The tragedy of Sporus is not only in what Nero did to him, it is in how Rome allowed it, watched it, and sometimes even applauded it. History remembers emperors through monuments, battles, and laws, but sometimes the truest reflection of an era lies not in the triumphs of rulers, but in the suffering of the powerless. The story of Sporus, the boy Nero castrated and forced to replace his dead empress, is one such mirror. His life exposes the darkest corners of the Roman world, the fragility of children in the face of absolute authority, the cruelty embedded in imperial politics, and the dangerous extremes of obsession and unchecked power. To understand why this story still matters nearly 2,000 years later, one must look beyond the personal tragedy and toward the broader consequences it revealed about the empire, its people, and the nature of tyranny itself. When Nero first chose Sporus, it was not merely an act of madness. It was a declaration that the emperor believed he was above nature itself. In ancient Rome, masculinity, lineage, and bodily integrity were guiding pillars of society. To mutilate a child, strip him of identity, and force him to live as a spectral imitation of a dead woman shattered every cultural boundary. Nero's decision challenged Rome's deepest values, revealing that when power becomes divine in a ruler's mind, human beings become clay, malleable, disposable, and reshaped for the ruler's desires. This violation set a chilling precedent. If a child could be turned into an empress, then anyone's identity, dignity, or fate could be reshaped by imperial whim. People in the empire, even those who never saw Sporus, understood the disturbing message. The emperor had power not only over life and death, but over the definitions of gender, status, and humanity itself. Such a belief made Nero not simply dangerous, but destabilizing. But Sporus's story also exposed a deeper truth about Roman society. The empire was a machine built on spectacle. Whether it was gladiatorial games, executions, or imperial ceremonies, Rome craved drama. Nero's forced marriage to Sporus was shocking, but it was also watched, discussed, imitated in jokes, and whispered about by citizens who accepted spectacle as a normal part of life. Even after Nero's death, Sporus was treated not as a victim to be protected, but as a symbol to be displayed by Nymphidius, Otho, and Vitellius. Each emperor used him to rewrite narratives, assert dominance, or entertain crowds. His existence became a stage, his suffering a performance. This reveals something unsettling. Rome did not merely tolerate cruelty, it expected it. The emperor's power relied not only on force, but on the willingness of society to watch, obey, and sometimes enjoy the spectacles created at the expense of vulnerable lives. Sporus's story shows how a powerful empire can shape public morality, normalizing atrocities when they are performed under the banner of tradition, politics, or entertainment. Yet the consequences of Nero's actions extended far beyond personal tragedy or moral decay. They also contributed to the empire's political collapse. Nero's obsession with performance, pleasure, and personal fantasies distracted him from governing. While he transformed Sporus into an empress, the provinces burned with rebellion. While he hosted weddings and theatrical banquets, military commanders plotted against him. While he indulged in delusions, senators lost faith, the treasury collapsed, and the empire spiraled into the deadly chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors. Sporus became a symbol of Nero's downfall. To many Romans, he represented the emperor's foolishness, decadence, and detachment from reality. The more Sporus appeared in public ceremonies, dressed as Poppaea, the more Rome saw Nero not as a ruler, but as a man consumed by his own illusions. Roman historians later used Sporus to illustrate Nero's moral decline, positioning the boy at the center of a narrative that helped justify Nero's overthrow. In this way, Sporus, though powerless, became part of the political rhetoric that shaped Rome's memory of its most infamous emperor. But Sporus's story matters for another reason. It exposes the limits of survival under tyranny. Despite passing through the hands of four powerful men, Nero, Nymphidius, Otho, and Vitellius, Sporus never found protection, freedom, or dignity. Each ruler saw him as a symbol, a tool, a performance. Not one saw him as a human being. In the end, the greatest cruelty he suffered was not the castration or the forced marriage, but the complete erasure of his identity. He lived as an empress, a symbol of rebellion, a political ornament, and a tragic actor in Vitellius's planned execution spectacle, but never as himself. His suicide was not cowardice. It was the final act of resistance in a life that offered no choices. When Vitellius planned to parade him publicly and reenact the abduction of Proserpina, Sporus understood that the empire intended to destroy him for entertainment. His decision to die on his own terms was an act of courage, and a condemnation of the world that had ruined him. While his life ended young, his story endured. Historians preserved his name as a warning about emperors who lose their moral compass and societies that tolerate cruelty. Writers in later centuries referenced him as an emblem of tyranny's victims. Philosophers used his fate to question the nature of power. In modern times, scholars re-examine his story to understand gender, identity, and exploitation in ancient Rome, recognizing that his tragedy resonates today because it reveals timeless truths about human vulnerability under oppressive systems. Sporus's story forces the world to ask difficult questions. What happens when power becomes absolute? Who protects the innocent when rulers demand obedience? What are the consequences when society normalizes cruelty for entertainment? How many lives are crushed when one man believes himself above nature, law, and morality? The Roman Empire eventually stabilized after years of bloodshed, but it never erased the memory of its darkest excesses. The story of Sporus survived not because Rome wanted to remember it, but because the world needed to. In the end, Sporus stands as a silent witness to the cruelty of emperors, the fragility of identity under tyranny, and the tragic cost of a world that valued spectacle over humanity. His life, though shaped by forces far beyond his control, became one of history's most haunting reminders of how power can deform both rulers and the societies that enable them.